blame him. I had it coming to me. All right, we're live. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian back with you, joined by my wife, my gregarious, my lively, my skillful with yarn wife, Katie. Say hello to everyone, Katie.
Good evening. It sounded like thunder. I think it was a car.
So, for those of you who are not familiar with this format, this is something that my wife and I, every few months or so, we actually did pretty good this time around. I think it was only about a month ago that we did our last one, but
I was gonna say, is this the second one in 2025?
yeah,
And it's only the third month.
every few months or so we get around to reviewing Catholic books. Specifically, we try to focus on literature, novels, these kinds of things, and reviews of works that are, as far as I can tell, not very reviewed on the social media. So while we are at it, we also enjoy ourselves with a local craft brew, except for the fact that Katie and I are both in the process of going through the keto diet. And so we are not drinking beer at the moment due to the high carb content of beer. So we are instead giving you guys tonight books and wine. And the wine
doesn't sound as good.
I don't change the name because books and beer sounds better, but
and the wine isn't local either because
the wine that we are drinking is Bonterra.
Get a close up on that bird.
It's Cabernet Sauvignon.
I bought it because of the bird on the label.
It's got a little cardinal on it.
No. You didn't have the crest.
It's a finch.
It's a finch on like a thistle, like a Eeyore thistle.
It's a California wine. It's a 22. It's a red. It's a Cabernet Sauvignon. Not much to say about it. It's tasty. I think Katie's read on the back that it's got a hint of tobacco and leather.
So on the back end.
Make of that what you will.
The initial taste is like very sweet, actually.
So usually we would be reviewing an interesting beer that we had picked up, but the wines, it's just it's a Cabernet.
From the grocery store. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's a Cabernet Sauvignon. I think it's decent enough. But to the good stuff, we read for this time. I don't know how the gloss is usually pretty bad on this, but The Long Loneliness by Dorothy Day, the autobiography of the legendary Catholic social activist. And I think this would be our second biography. I mean, I guess if you want to count Black Elk Speaks as biographical, though that's controversial, given that it's an as told to with John Nehrhart. Go back and watch our review of Black Elk Speaks. But no, this one was penned by servant of God Dorothy Day herself.
We were discussing the subtitle. Do you think she wrote the subtitle? Did she call herself the legendary Catholic social activist?
Yeah, this is probably after the fact. I don't even know when this was first published.
1952.
52, right?
I looked it up.
I think she died in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, Dorothy Day, I guess probably is a familiar name. At least she seems to be one of those names that a lot of people know the name. They don't necessarily know much about her. And so much as they do know things about her, sometimes it's of questionable or dubious sources in terms of who she is and what her purpose was, which we can kind of get into here a little bit tonight. But this was from her childhood up through about World War II. I guess it left off maybe a little bit post World War II, I think.
That's Peter Morin dying just towards the end.
So,
which I'm not spoiling anything. That's the name of the chapter.
Yeah, and it's an autobiography that was written, over 80 years ago. Mm-hmm. In terms of
she died in 1980.
1980, yeah. So Peter Morin, yes, we wouldn't be spoiling it, saying that he is no longer with us. He was an old man when she's telling the story. So, but anyways, before we get to Peter, I guess from the outset, Katie, do you have thoughts? Do you have anything to just like introduce people to the story and your thoughts on it?
I have two thoughts. I think, like you were saying, we did our review of Father Brown, I think in January.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's only March, really like the beginning of March, and we've already read this book. So I think that kind of speaks to the ease of reading it. I really love her voice. It was very, I don't know, it was just easy to read and engaging to read. Yeah.
So that was one thought. You said you had two?
Well, just so if you look back on our books and beer and like look at the time in between, I think this is probably the quickest turnaround. Isn't the right, but this episode happening now is like the quickest we've done another episode, that we finished another book with these kinds of videos.
So as far as the long loneliness goes, from a like woman's point of view, do you have any like? She doesn't explicitly define what the long loneliness is, but she mentions it several times. So
I feel it. Yeah. I think it's just the fact that we're in the valley of tears, and things can be good here, but they're never going to be perfect, and people will let us down, and we're always seeking that companionship and seeking that that closeness, and much of what we're looking for can only be found through our relationship with God. And that can be very difficult because it can feel very abstract. Whereas, human people that are in our lives are like physically there, but even with that, there's that like missing piece, and that desire to be intimately known. And only God can know us at that level. So she refers to that several times throughout. I was really struck by her struggle. I feel like it was years of her knowing the Catholic faith was true. But she knew that was, one, it was going to affect her friendships, and two, it was going to require her to change her way of living. And three, I think she also felt like once she took that step, she wasn't ever going to go back. And so that was very intimidating, because it's just everything's different forever for the rest of your life. So that stood out to me. I just kept I feel like we kept finishing a chapter and finishing a chapter and finishing a chapter, and she still hadn't become Catholic, even though she was like attending mass and praying the rosary.
Yeah, so I guess just to give some context, she's coming of age at the turn of the century, really a young adult in the teens, the 19 teens. And she's kind of when she's coming up, she's bound, her parents are moving the family all over the country. They're in California at one time, they're in Chicago, I think, at another time, and then they end up on Long Island. And as a young adult, she ends up over in Greenwich Village in New York City, which I guess if you know anything about early 20th century history, I don't know. Like I spoke about this, so I feel like for some of you guys that watch this channel regularly, you may have heard me mention this, but I've spoke about the difference of the left, just broadly speaking, the political left, and the difference between them in the last century and in this century. And it's almost night and day. In some ways, you can kind of follow the trajectory, except that, today I say it's a much more like homogenous movement. It's much more, the left today is much more, what's the word? It's not countercultural anymore. It's like the mainstream at this point, you could say. And it's backed by a lot of money. There's a lot of very wealthy people that identify as liberal. It was not that case in Dorothy Day's time. It was much more fringe, like fifth column, and especially when you get to somewhere like Greenwich Village. New York City today, like many of the like major cities, have just been totally like gentrified, and I don't think there's anywhere left, as far as I know, and if it is, it's hiding itself quietly. But I don't think there's any of those like kind of neat little places left, like Greenwich Village. Not that I really would have wanted to hang out in Greenwich Village, but like reading about the characters and stuff of the time, it's kind of cool. It was like kind of slummy, kind of seedy, really bohemian type characters ended up down there. Like today, I think I looked just for curiosity after reading this, and like like a one bedroom like closet apartment is like astronomical monthly rent. So yeah, so the entire area is like, don't go to Greenwich Village now looking for this. But in her time when she's there, she's hanging out with these like cast of characters. That's really just like I found it kind of the most interesting part of the book in some ways, because she's down there at a time when Emma Goldman is down there. And Emma, again, like for those of you guys who've listened to this channel, I've spoken of her a few times, especially on the series that I did on the eugenics movement and contraception and all of that. She's there involved in that whole scene. Not so much the eugenics movement, but she was definitely involved in the contraceptive movement, birth control movement. As well, a very young pre-Russian Revolution Leon Trotsky's down there. And so, yeah, Trotsky, he goes back to Russia after basically they're in exile. A bunch of the Russians ended up in exile. So if you know any of that story, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the czars, he was cracking down on radicals in his country, and a bunch of them fled the country, including Leon Trotsky. And he ends up in New York City, and he ends up in Greenwich Village, and he's like, Dorothy Day is hanging out with him. She's hanging out with Leon Trotsky, and she mentions him. I don't think she goes too into detail about like what their conversation. I mean, she mentions it a few times. It was earlier in the novel, and I was like, okay, well, that's super fascinating as someone who's just a huge like history buff of that period, the Russian Revolution. So to see that, so that kind of gives you an idea. I mean, she doesn't mention her, but I'm sure she would have like rubbed elbows with like Margaret Sanger. That's where Margaret was doing her work down there on the birth control movement.
Rubbing elbows.
Yeah. Now at the same time, there is a element of that Greenwich Village community that is part of the early free love movement. Emma Goldman was part of the early free love movement, and a few other characters. Margaret Sanger was not, actually. Interestingly enough, she was kind of, I think she was raised like Episcopal or something like that. So she kind of had like a little bit of a puritanical streak to her.
Well, I was going to say Dorothy kind of mentions that, and just
she's
says
very uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, just how she can't imagine being that way with multiple men, and even though she winds up in this common law marriage, but the whole idea of just a different person.
Yeah, it was a much more.
She's just like it strikes her as wrong or like irreverent or.
Yeah, it was a much more like heterogeneous movement back then. It was basically like if you were a social outcast, you were basically on the left, and you might have had your little cause, right? That you were, Emma Goldman. She wanted like the abolition of the family and the free love movement, and birth control was a part of that. But for Margaret Sanger, birth control, she was not for the free love movement. She thought that she was providing healthcare. That's what her whole thing was. She thought she switched it to a healthcare argument. For Dorothy Day, she was not part of the birth control movement. She was not part of the free love movement down there. Her thing was the labor movement.
Votes for women too, I thought.
Was she suffragette?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't remember that part.
I think that was one of the first times she went to jail.
I think I blocked that out.
It was like early in the book.
Oh,
But
yeah,
it was
yeah.
a Votes for Women march, and
So that
she
would have
got
been one of her.
arrested.
Yeah, it was like that. It was these like mutual causes that these people, they were outcasts for whatever reason. They were outcasts, and they would end up in these little communities together. So um, that's her sort of the early part of the story, which I thought was actually the better part of the book. Um, and then she meets at a certain point. She meets probably the key character in this whole thing, and I think in many respects, the reason why we remember Dorothy Day today is because she meets Peter Morin, who was even when he met her, he was significantly older, I think, and he was involved in the labor movement, and he was already this kind of like iconic character in some ways, and their lives had paralleled each other. But one day she returns from work or a trip or something. She returns home and he's like waiting in her house. And she's like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "Well, so and so said that I needed to come introduce myself to you," because he had all of these grand ideas. And somebody said, "Well, you got to go speak to Dorothy because she's the one that can help make some of this happen." Dorothy had been a journalist, and so Peter, very involved in the labor movements, and he has these like unique theories about labor and poverty and the value of honest work and the value of honest wages. And out of their partnership arose what they're probably both best remembered for as the Catholic Workers Movement. And that paper still goes today. And then they opened up, though she doesn't go too deeply into this. They open up Catholic worker farms as a movement, but it's all, even the tenets of the Catholic worker farm were basically all modeled around Peter Morin's um, these ideas that he had been floating around and spreading to people. So that's kind of I think the second act of the book, if you will, is her time with Peter and the Workers' Party, which again, I think as a narrative, I found the second half a little bit more sluggish. But
see, and I think I like the second half.
Did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate what she did. I mean, I'm a fan of Dorothy Day. I'm a fan of so in my own family, I come from a family of pro-labor people, so it's part of my heritage, if you will. Like, my great uncle, he was an arbitrator for the unions, and then my grandfather was pro-union, my great grandfather was pro-union. Like, it's part of my blood, right? So I'm a very pro-labor kind of guy. So the ideology of Peter Morin has always kind of spoke to me. Now that said, I think it is worth acknowledging that there's a little bit of anarchism involved in the movement, and she acknowledges that, and she even says that the early left in New York City was actually kind of going along with what I was saying a minute ago, was actually a very anarchic movement. There were true anarchists that were involved in it, but also just there was no real cohesion to the whole thing. It was very anarchic, and I think because of that, the reputation of the Catholic Workers Movement and the Catholic Workers Farm as it stands today, many decades after Peter's death and after her death, uh, probably some of you that would watch this would think that there's questionable things about Dorothy and about the movement.
She even mentions with some other, I think it was on the farm, where people came and claimed a room that was actually in use by someone else, but they refused to leave. So everybody was just like, oh, okay, you can use that room. Or they would go into a room that was being used by someone and take the blankets because they were going to use them in their space. And so, you have people who are kind-hearted and giving and, we're going to live in peace and in harmony. And then you have folks that come and take advantage of that.
That's the age-old problem of communism.
Yeah. So she mentions that a few different episodes in the book with that happening.
Well, then, and I think, we have the hindsight now, and I mean, she was alive through some of this. By the 60s, by the 70s, the labor movement basically got sidelined by when the left sort of started picking up ideological things. It picked up the civil rights movement, and then, in the certainly by the 90s, and certainly well into the turn of the century, it picked up the LG movement. Got to kind of differentiate there. And then, of course, by the 2010s, it picks up the T part of that as well. So now you've got all of that other stuff that's gotten mixed up into the leftist movement, where today the left is hardly known as the, like, when if you were to ask most people, like, what do you think of when you think of the the Democratic Party, for example, labor for many people might not even be on the top 5 list. Whereas for Dorothy's time, she was not she was not a libertine by far. She was not somebody that was socially and okay with the sort of um, social experiments that were taking place, right? Like, she wanted a family. She wanted just like the kind of like social things that today would be considered, would make her like far right, if anything, on her social stances. Um, so yeah, like, you kind of have to put her in her context of her time, and not try to, like, even though in some ways I would probably be, because I had an interest before we moved to where we're at right now. I was looking at the potential of, like, maybe claiming a little plot of land as a Catholic workers farm. But then when you start looking up online, one of the things that she wanted with the Catholic workers farm was that anybody would be able to claim their farm as a Catholic workers farm, so long as they had like a very broad set of like restrictions to be able to qualify. And so because of that, you find some pretty wacky people online who are claiming to have Catholic workers farm, and as a representative of like the Roman Catholic Church, it doesn't look very well for her. At the same time, you have people like Dr. Larry Chapp and his wife, who I think are very orthodox in their faith, and I think they kind of are a little bit more in line with the spirit of Peter Marin and Dorothy Day, which is a rarer thing, unfortunately. And I think she she kind of cuts this book off long before that, but I think, from what I remember, somewhere along the line, she started acknowledging that the movement, even in her own time before she passed away, had sort of veered away from its initial. I think it probably took a major hit when Peter Marin passed away, because I think he was sort of the driving force behind the Catholic workers movement.
And I wonder, even with his illness.
Yeah, she said
he was ill for a while, and that really affected him.
So all in all, super fascinating read. She is a servant of God. She's been raised to the level of servant of God. I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's a cause for Peter. I don't think it's been necessarily picked up or recognized by Rome at this point, but there's a small, if I remember right, I should have looked before we came on, but I think there is a small. So you're dealing with 2 potential saints, and so in some ways this is kind of like a 20th century confessions or something. I mean, maybe not to that extent, but it's the conversion of of somebody that's a saint, and their process. And she does, and this actually didn't really go into this too much. I know Katie had mentioned it, but I didn't. But she does. She kind of lays out the long road for her conversion and sort of the struggles, because she was coming from that Bohemian movement where the Catholic Church was, like, in many ways antithetical.
Well, she had her the man that she had been living with for years, and at one point she says explicitly, she was like, becoming Catholic means I have to lose him.
Yeah.
And
I think because he was like, he left. Didn't he abandon him?
He left several times, but I think she realized, becoming Catholic, she would have to cut off that relationship, because she knew he would never join her as a Catholic, and for her to go to confession and confess this relationship, and then be told, make her act of contrition and then go right back to that relationship, would not be sincere. And so I think that was a big part of the delay.
So, yeah, The Long Loneliness, the autobiography of the Catholic social activist. Would you recommend?
I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed reading it. I really enjoyed her voice. Actually, I think my favorite chapter might have been the chapter where it was
Speaking of which.
Basically her description of Peter, the chapter when she talks about his death. She goes on and it's almost like a eulogy.
Well, yeah, there was one thing
it's gorgeous.
I was going to read. Thank you for reminding me. I thought this was kind of a cool paragraph. This is towards the end. So Peter has, at this point, passed away. And she's, as Katie was saying, she's kind of eulogizing. But this is, to begin with, she has a quote from Peter. Quote, "We need to make the kind of society," Peter had said, "where it is easier for people to be good." End quote. And because his love of God made him love his neighbor, lay down his life indeed for his brother, he wanted to cry out against the evils of the day, the state, war, usury, the degradation of man, the lack of a philosophy of work. He sang the delights of poverty. He was not talking of destitution as a means making a step to the land, of getting back to the dear natural things of earth and sky, of home and children. He cried out against the machine because, as Pope Pius XI had said, raw materials went into the factory and came out ennobled, and man went in and came out degraded. So I thought that was really good. And I thought that's super fascinating. Again, like she's writing of the time of Peter, but think about some of you maybe watching this are my age, maybe older, maybe younger. But even in my earlier days, when I was a kid, I remember some leftist people. I remember some hippies. And you think of this, though, right? You think he wanted to cry out against the evils of his day, the state, war, usury. And that just kind of makes me think of like where the left as a movement is today. I would say, if anything, those are their calling cards, right? Their calling cards are the state, war, and usury. So it's just a sad testament to how degraded the labor movement became. But there is a real sense in which in the Catholic Church we're called to be, it's one of the, everyone wants to focus on the LGBT thing, but people forget about the other sins that cry out to the Lord for vengeance. And one of them is depriving people of their wages, of their just wages. And as Catholics, I think we need voices like Peter. We need voices like Dorothy, probably more now than ever, because I think we actually are kind of coming to a point where, what were we talking about earlier? Was it today where I talked about Pottersville?
Yeah.
What was it in the context of? Oh, people trying to buy our home, right? There's people that are trying to like,
because we moved, and so we're getting like emails
and it's like there's these sharks that are out there, and they're like they're trying to rob people of the George Bailey dream, right, of home ownership and family life, and they want to come in like these conglomerates and just like devour everything, and just you would end up, I think, in the end, like we're almost headed towards the like dystopian Pottersville in some ways. So yeah, I think we need these kind of voices now more than ever. So in that sense, I definitely think people should familiarize themselves with Dorothy, and they should familiarize themselves with Peter and with the Catholic workers movement. And I would love to see Orthodox Catholics go in and subvert the movement and take it over and make it Orthodox again. But that could just be a pipe dream. But anyways, I think the book itself was well worth reading. I think Dorothy's super fascinating person. Peter's definitely super fascinating as well, and I would recommend this book. How about for children? We said we were going to discuss that.
Reading.
I don't think kids would be interested.
Yeah,
maybe teens.
I mean, I feel like our kid was in the room for some of it, and then sometimes we were like, okay, we're gonna stop reading now because she's talking about like her relationship, or like, but I don't think, like, interest wise, I don't think it would be.
Maybe for a teenager, but
yeah,
younger, I don't think they would understand it.
Yeah.
All right.
High schooler.
So the next time, I was about to say next week. There's no way we're going to get to it next week. Next time.
How many pages?
We're going to pick up one recommended by two great men, one living, who needs prayers, and then one deceased who's probably praying for us. This was recommended by both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. This is called The Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. And on the front here, it says from Pope Francis, I advise you to read it. So the Holy Father's recommendation here. This is speaking of a dystopia, this is a dystopian novel of the future written by a Catholic priest in the last century. And
the Prince bed. How many
I'm excited to read this one. Lord of the World. I think it's actually about the Antichrist, if I'm not mistaken.
Over 300 pages. Yeah, we couldn't finish it in a week.
So you guys are going to hopefully be there for the next one. I see Phil with the strawberry Phil forever. My wife came up with that. I can't take credit for that. It's good to see you, Phil. Thanks for your support, the channel, and that's all that I got. Is that all you got?
Yeah.
All right. Well, God bless you guys. And yeah, thank you. We'll see you next time.